really just a matter of poor time management, nothing else, and vigorous and rigorous academic exchange. It is with great pleasure and privilege that I introduce Professor Jeffery Olick as the keynote speaker of our conference to deliver the Provost lecture. He is Professor of Sociology and History at the University of Virginia, and he's the author of and editor of several books, among them In the House of the Hangman, The Agonies of German Defeat, 1943 to 1949, University of Chicago Press, 2005, The Politics of Regret, On Collective Memory and Historical Responsibility, 2007. He's the editor of States of Memory, Continuities, Conflicts, and Transformations in National Retrospection, 2003, and he's the co-editor of The Collective Memory Reader, 2011, and he's also co-editor of two translations and critical editions of Frankfurt School work on public opinion. One is Guilt and Defense on the Legacies of National Socialism in Post-War Germany, published by Harvard University Press in 2010, and Group Experiment and Other Writings, the Frankfurt School on Public Opinion in Post-War Germany, published in 2011. Add to this several key journal articles, and you're looking at who I think is one of the preeminent social memory scholars of our times. And since I have worked on similar issues in the past, I can assure you that the narcissism of small differences would prevent me from engaging in such praise if it wasn't for the tremendous intellectual depth that I and I think many others in the field also owe him. So please welcome Professor Jeffery Olick. The title of his talk is What is Memory? Intellectual and Institutional Foundations for Interdisciplinarity.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here. It's been an interesting morning. It's nice to see lots of old friends. I was about to shush Stony when he was reading the title of my talk because I wanted to use that as a frame, but I have to instead thank him for botching it because I can now restate it with good reason. It's not What is Memory, though I'll have a lot to say about that. The actual title, which I gave, is What is Memory Studies, which is at least somewhat distinct question from What is Memory. So, as stated, my topic for today is this field of memory studies. This conference today is under the rubric of memory studies, as are a great number of others that take place in various locations around the world. I said at a conference actually 2 weeks ago in Jerusalem that there's a bumper sticker in the part of the country I live in now that says, "Jesus is my co-pilot," and I leave that question open. But what I can say is that collective memory has been my travel agent, so I'm grateful to it. Like any enterprise, well, one of the things we learn from memory studies is that any enterprise tells a story about itself. And memory studies itself is not exempt from this requirement of telling a story. The story of memory studies, the one that you'll find in lots of first paragraphs, first chapters, book reviews, review essays, and talk, goes something like the following. There was, people claim, a memory boom that began sometime in the late 1970s and that has only begun to wind down since the turn of the millennium. Where did this memory boom come from? Following the decline of post-war modernist narratives of progressive improvement through an ever-expanding welfare state, nation-states turned to the past as a basis for shoring up their legitimacy. If the future could no longer legitimate them, they had to turn to the past. The decline of utopian visions supposedly redirected our gaze to collective pasts, which served as a repository of inspiration for repressed identities and unfulfilled claims. Without unifying collective aspirations that come from the future, identity politics proliferated. And most often, these identities nursed a wound and harbored a grudge. The memory boom thus unleashed a culture of trauma and regret, and states are now allegedly judged on how well they atone for their past misdeeds, rather than on how well they meet their fiscal obligations and inspire future projects. In the commercial sphere, according to this story, these transformations in political legitimation were supposedly matched by a commodification of nostalgia, a popularization of history, see the History Channel, and an interest in memory, both individual and collective. Both of the latter, individual and collective memory, are seen to be at risk, the former by neurological decay and sensory overload in a mass-mediated environment, the latter by dying generations and official denial. On the analytical side, the memory boom has supposedly also given rise to varieties of inquiry, including science, scholarship, memoir writing, curatorial work, oral history projects, and the like. While baby boomers worry about the living death of Alzheimer's disease, neuroscientists search for its biological basis. While trauma victims seek to overcome their ongoing suffering from post-traumatic stress, as we've just heard, psychologists develop frameworks for treatment. While past depression has seemingly become the coin of identity, cultural theorists inquire into the origins of the politics of victimhood. And while societies confront the legacies of their misdeeds, social and political scientists analyze the conditions for successful transition and salutary commemoration. All of these and more are constituents of what has come to be referred to as the new memory studies, which has acquired its own journals, been elaborated in countless edited volumes, established research centers, received grants, and been the subject of university courses. The conclusion of this story, however, is that sometime in the last 5 to 15 years, this memory boom has gone bust. And the prediction is that as the boom goes bust, the industry that has arisen to service the boom will also diminish. In other words, memory studies has had its day. How do we respond to this particular story? In the first place, we note that this story is most often told by those who are actually militating for the end of memory studies. What one notices very quickly, however, is that they started doing so almost before memory studies was born. Another thing we've learned from memory studies is not merely that every enterprise tells a story about itself, but of course that most of these stories are wrong, or at least they are created in the present for present purposes. This is what I'm pointing out in this latter quality, that it's mostly the opponents of memory studies who are saying that as the boom has gone bust, memory studies should disappear whence it came, and we can return to the normal business of psychological inquiry, historical studies, sociology, and literary studies unperturbed by this interloper concept. One of the goals of my own work over the last few years, and in collaboration with Donnie Levy, has been to rewrite this history of memory studies. One of the ways in which we do this, particularly in a long introductory essay to the Collective Memory Reader, which, as Donnie mentioned, was published last year by Oxford, is to look for older sources of memory studies and to see a continuity of contemporary efforts with these earlier moments. One of the central features of the myth of contemporary memory studies is that there was this guy named Maurice Halbwachs who in 1925 coined the term collective memory, was subsequently forgotten absolutely for 50 years, and suddenly sometime between 1977 and 1983 rediscovered and suddenly became an international hero of academia and cultural life. One of the things we do in our effort in this reader is not only to point out that there were more than 250 books published before 1925, that is before Halbwachs' supposedly original use of the term collective memory, that employed the term collective memory. In the second place, that in the years after Halbwachs did his writing on collective memory, that is between 1925 and 1945, in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, there is a lost continuous tradition of memory studies. So one of the ways we respond to this myth is by basically calling it that and saying there's both earlier work on memory and there is a greater continuity of memory. I'd like to tell three particular vignettes from the history of memory studies, since one of the additional topics of my talk today is supposedly the institutional and intellectual conditions for interdisciplinarity. One of the results of the myth of memory studies as it's constituted in contemporary discourse is that we have repressed the memory of earlier memory scholarship. There's a famous example of there is a famous example of this kind of an argument in the work of Mary Douglas, the anthropologist, who in her book, How Institutions Think, gives the example of Frederick Bartlett from the 1930s, a British psychologist who, in fact, in the last chapter of his book, entitled Social Remembering, is in dialogue with Hall blocks and expands and expounds on the concept to show that Bartlett's reputation and the memory of Bartlett has been forgotten, so that psychology has forgotten its own more social roots. I can add to this in terms of the story of psychology in the way that it's usually done by contemporary intellectual historians, namely by pointing to the legacies of Wilhelm Wundt, who is often, along with Hermann Ebbinghaus, taken as the founding father of experimental psychology. That is, had those rooms in the basements of psychology buildings where, at least in my day, it was, I think, $3 an hour you were paid to be subject to some kind of an experiment. The price, I think, has probably gone up in intervening years. The idea of an experimental psychology lab was something that had a key formation at the hands of Wundt and Ebbinghaus. Now, Wundt's legacy for contemporary psychology has diminished in part because he was at odds with the subsequent emergence of behaviorism. He was an advocate of a different model known as structuralism at the time. What's also forgotten about Wundt, however, is that while he was inventing experimental social psychology, and cognition research, experimental research on cognition, he also produced a 10-volume book called Kulturpsychologie or Volkspsychologie, that is, the psychology of peoples, which in retrospect can be taken as a source for a cultural or even social psychology, which is at odds with some of the paradigms in contemporary research, at least in the United States. Which the argument goes has repressed or forgotten psychology's more social interest and social. So the dominant framework in contemporary psychology is to push towards the more micro, that is, towards the neurological, to the cellular substrates of memory, as well as within the scientific model of experimental research, imaging, and the like. The bottom line or the punchline of this story is that in doing so, it's forgetting that psychology itself was conceived in a much more rigorous and in-depth dialogue with philosophy, with sociology, and with cultural studies more generally. And the second story, just I'd like to hint at, the vignette, is the story of Hall blocks himself. I mentioned Hall blocks published his first piece on memory in 1925, The Social Frameworks of Memory. What's often forgotten is that is his first book, and there were two subsequent, his first book on memory, he'd written on other things, and there were two subsequent works on memory. First of all, the legendary Topography of the Holy Land, published in the early 1930s, and then posthumous set of essays called The Collective Memory. Some of the intellectual history of Hall blocks has gotten confused over time. What's interesting about this, if you trace out the development of Hall blocks' thought on collective memory, what you find is he's very much involved in a debate, in a discussion, in fact in an argument with colleagues in other disciplines. And two groups are particularly important. The first is the historian Marc Bloch and Lucien Febvre, who are known as the founding fathers of the Annales tradition in French historiography. The second is the a psychiatrist. For some reason, I'm having my memory moment. The name.
Not Bloch.
Not Bloch, the other one. It doesn't matter. I'll come back. It'll occur to me in a minute. I've written this name 1,000 times, and it's not Charcot, the other guy. Janet. Yes, Janet. Thank you. Pierre Janet. Thank you. I don't know what's going on here. In fact, arguing very clearly over whether memory is a biological process, principally a neurological phenomenon, or whether it is principally a social phenomenon. Now, Hall blocks himself was a student and follower and, in fact, proponent of Durkheim's sociology. And what we find in this literature, in this debate, is that Hall blocks is actually quite imperialistic. And what he's telling his friends, the historians, and his friends, the psychologists, is that actually the only dominant and most important, in fact, the only important enterprise is sociology, and you all ought to get on board and become sociologists, and all these other enterprises will be subordinated to it. In fact, you can't understand the evolution of some of Hall Bloch's later writings on memory if you don't understand that this is what he's trying to do. He is, in fact, overeager. He's an imperialist. He's trying to colonize the disciplines for sociology. The response he gets from Bloch is very interesting, that you have no way of taking into account error in collective memory, and that is judging it on the basis of facts, which was in fact the instigation for Hall Bloch to write the legendary topography of the Holy Land. A third interesting anecdote is another source of memory studies, and the concept of memory in the late 19th century was a completely forgotten name by a biologist by the name of Richard Zeeman. Daniel Schachter, very well-known psychologist of memory, has actually wrote as a graduate student, as a side project, an intellectual biography of Zeeman, who's been forgotten. We've forgotten Zeeman, but we haven't forgotten two of the terms that he coined. The first term is the term meme, M-N-E-M-E. We now reduce this to meme. What was very interesting is that Zeeman actually started out in conversation with evolutionary biology. And what he was trying to do was to come up with a cultural equivalent to genes. Right, remember the debate that was going on at the time. Lamarck, the biologist Lamarck, had asserted that acquired characteristics are heritable. That is, that if you stretch your neck out, if you're a horse who stretches his neck out long enough, you'll eventually become, your children will eventually be giraffes. This, of course, is not the way it works. We came up with genes. Genes are the mode of transmitting characters in the process of natural selection, as articulated. Zeeman was interested in whether there was a cultural equivalent to genes, which is why he coined the term meme, which has then been adapted in contemporary discourse by the evolutionary psychologist Richard Dawkins as a meme. What we see in these stories are three models of interdisciplinarity, none of which I think is particularly recommendable. In the first place, we find a forgotten side project. In the second place, we find imperialism. And in the third place, we find a form of reductionism. All of these then raise the question about what are the salutary conditions for interdisciplinarity or interdisciplinary scholarship. And that's what I'd really like to talk about today. Now, if there is to be such a thing as memory studies, one would not unreasonably assume that that thing, that enterprise, is to some extent constituted by the object which it asserts, namely memory. That memory studies, if it is anything, is going to be, in some sense, the study of memory. So you'll indulge me for a minute if I advance a rather outrageous thesis, intentionally outrageous and only slightly facetious, namely that there is no such thing as memory. Okay, what a ridiculous thing to say. But I mean it seriously, or, well, mostly seriously. What do I mean by there's no such thing as memory? Okay. Memory is arguably a useless signifier. That is, what might we refer to with the term memory, such that we might get organized about studying it and call our enterprise memory studies? And what is the implication of my statement that there is no such thing as memory for the intellectual and institutional conditions of memory studies? I actually like to presage my conclusion, which is to simply say that my argument that there's no such thing as memory should be the beginning rather than the end of discussion aimed at constituting a field of memory studies. And my task in the remaining 20 or so minutes, I believe, well, just about, will be to demonstrate that. When we use the term memory, let's think about the wide variety of processes and entities that we can refer to. I have things that are stored on my hard drive. I refer to this as memory. I sit around the Thanksgiving Day table and tell stories with my family. And in one sense or another, that is called memory. We celebrate or mourn aspects of our history, and we call doing so, in some regard, memory. Collective memory in this regard. One strategy, then, might be relatively obvious. That is, we could say that all these other uses of the word memory are mere metaphors, and that there is something that we really mean by memory proper. And this memory proper, as we all know from our lay usage, should be the property, academically, institutionally, of psychologists. Because when we're talking about memory, we're really talking about brains. And that is, when we lie alone by ourselves at night in bed, and we think about what happened that day, or for some random reason, an image of our grandmother pops up, and we don't say anything. We're either alone or we don't say anything to the person lying next to us, and we just sort of enjoy that memory, or maybe stress about that memory, depending on your grandmother, and we keep it to ourselves. Memory seems as primally individual a process or a phenomenon as there is, like pain. We can notice somebody's pain, we can sympathize with their pain, but their pain is their own ultimately. We cannot feel it in the same way that they do. The same thing could be true of memory. So one strategy might be to say, all right, we've got real memory, which is the stuff psychologists study, which is located someplace in the brain, is constituted by neurological processes, maybe at a higher level of abstraction, cognitive processes that can be studied with psychological techniques. That this is memory proper, and everything else is a metaphorical extension of memory. And that is, commemoration may have something to do with the past, but it's not memory, because memory is really the kind of thing we're worried about losing when we develop Alzheimer's disease, or we get old, or we simply don't practice enough. How good an answer is that? In fact, it's not a very good answer, because scratch the surface of a lay psychological understanding of memory with even the slightest dose, that is the kind of dose that I as a sociologist have gotten, of real psychology, and we find that the concept of memory isn't actually very useful in psychology at all. That is, the first thing that you'll learn in an introductory psychology class is about all the different kinds of memory and about how different they are from each other. Okay. There is, first of all, and these terms are probably outdated, but there is episodic memory versus semantic memory. That is, I remember going through an experience which is different from the fact that I know that Barack Obama is President of the United States, at least for the next little while. 5 years. We distinguish between episodic and semantic memory. We distinguish between various kinds of ways of storing various kinds of experiences. I mentioned that there was a second thing we got besides meme from Zaman. The other thing that Zaman gave us was the term engram, which still has some currency in psychology. Engram is theorized as the physiological impression that an experience makes neurologically. One of the things we know about our experiences, though, is that different kinds of experience, different kinds of sense perception, are processed and stored in different ways. Literary critics know this in their bones because they've read Proust. And what Proust tells us is, right at the beginning, I bit into the petit madeleine, I bit into the tea cookie, and the world of involuntary memories swept me away. We all know that taste and smell are particularly powerful mnemonic stimuli. By the same token, music is remembered in a different way. If you're trying to memorize, my wife teaches medical students, and they often sing. They have to memorize long lists of things, and they make songs out of them. One of the things we know is that if you sing something, it's easier to remember. I don't know exactly why that is. I'm sure there are people in the room, Adam could tell us, Bill could tell us, why that is the case. But music is memorable in a particular way because it's processed by the brain in a different way than olfaction, smell, or taste is. The same thing we know about semantic memory. The memorizing of a list of facts for a history exam, for instance, is a different kind of process than learning to recite a poem, is certainly a different kind of process neurologically than these other things. So, What we know is that if I say there's no such thing as memory, restricting it and saying the memory psychologists talk about as the real memory and everything else is metaphorical is already problematic, because psychology of memory is studying many different kinds of memory which are processed, handled, dealt with in many different ways, have many different sources, and have many different outcomes. We know from studies, for instance, of traumatic brain injury that very weird and unfortunate things that happen to people can render them missing some kinds of qualities, but remembering or able to deal with other kinds of processes that are very separate that you would have thought would have been connected. Recognition of an image in a picture for which, and you know what it is, I know that that's a picture of an apple, but you can't come up with a word for apple. You've lost the word even though you understand exactly what it is. So restricting memory to the memory that we assume, we outside of psychology assume that psychologists are talking about, is not much help. A second strategy in my assertion of the claim that there is no such thing as memory is to say, in fact, that as a sociologist, in my bones, in my training, in my livelihood, I am trained to assert that, in fact, if there is anything that is memory proper, it is certainly not the things that psychologists are talking about. In other words, we have a term that we call collective memory, which I would argue is, for me as a sociologist, more convincing as a candidate for what memory might be. What do I mean by that? Well, first of all, I should say that I enjoy provoking psychologists by saying if anybody requires an adjective to designate their special case, it should be psychologists who should be required to say individual memory. There's regular memory, and then there's individual memory, because for me as a sociologist, collective memory is the norm, and individual memory is the outlying case that requires explanation. Well, what do I mean by that? One of the things we get from Hallblocks, the legacy of Hallblocks, is the recognition that even the kind of memory that we conceive of as the most purely personal is itself shaped by and structured by and generated with our social identities and what Hallblocks called social frameworks. I can prove it to you right now. Okay. Picture your grandmother. Done? Okay. You're all able to do that. Probably you wouldn't have done that today if I hadn't asked you to. You cannot share that picture with me, and yet I caused it to come about. What was necessary in order for that memory, that mnemonic event, to take place? You needed a cue, but you also needed a language. Right? If I had said it in some other language that you don't speak, you wouldn't know what I was asking. But the very idea, the identity of grandmother is something that is coded in language and is social. What Hallblocks pointed out is even the most profoundly individual memory is in this way permeated with our social being. We remember as social beings in social contexts and in response to social cues. When we lie in bed alone at night, trying to remember what we've got on the calendar for tomorrow or the conversation you had yesterday, and you're not telling anyone about it, you're still doing it in terms of your identities and in terms of cultural knowledge that you have that helped you interpret that sensory experience and helps you categorize things. This is one fundamental level of what we might mean by memory is fundamentally social, not individual. There's a second level. The second is that we often engage in what we might call mnemonic activities or mnemonic practices in social situations. We reminisce, we tell stories. One of the things we know is that there's a certain quality of memory that is distributed. So if you have three people who try to memorize some facts, say for a high school history test. I have a daughter in high school history right now, and every evening it's quizzing on the facts. If you have several people working on it together, you can recall more than any one individual would have been able to recall. And it's not simply that you do the first third, I do the second third, and she does the third third. It's that little cues, little hints can help you recall things that you might have forgotten otherwise. We know, for instance, when you're trying to recite a poem and you can't remember, if somebody gives you the first word of the line, you can remember the rest of the line. You're more likely to be able to remember the rest of the line. If someone tells you what came before, you can produce what came after. wide variety of our activities that we refer to as memory, therefore take place in social groups and dialogically between people. And in fact, the social perspective is to emphasize that the basis of our existence is in fact dialogical rather than monological. The third level and way in which memory is inherently collective is what I would refer to, against my claim that it makes no sense to refer to one kind of memory as memory proper, is collective memory proper. So I do that with all irony and with the intention of annoying a few particular individuals, which is always useful. That there is memory of the group itself. That is, the kinds of symbols, commemorations, identities, and the like that a group engages in and invests in preserving. We build museums, we put on parades, we commemorate with flags and other symbols. We teach a certain kind of history which we consider knowledge of which we consider essential to belonging or membership in the group. So that, for instance, it would make no sense to treat, for instance, the memory of the Civil War in the United States. If we were to do a survey of the American population, how many people know what the Gettysburg Address was about? I would venture to say that a larger proportion of people would be able to recite the first few words of it than who would be able to give a coherent explanation as to its topic. We all can say 7 years ago, and most of us stop right about there. Now, either of these facts does not mean that the Gettysburg Address or the U.S. Civil War is not part of collective memory in the United States, that it's not an important piece of knowledge which may be preserved archivally, and by that I mean archival both literally and figuratively, so that it can be reactivated. We would not then say that if it hasn't met a certain threshold, let's say 85% of the population being able to pass a test, that it's not part of collective memory. So what do we do about all of this, and what effect does it have on memory studies as a field or an interdiscipline? As I said before, the claim that there is no such thing as memory, which obviously means somewhat facetiously, is that, first of all, that there are many, many things we mean by memory, and that they are often very distinct conceptually and practically from each other. So what I've tried to do in my work is to replace use of the concept of the term memory as anything other than an emblem or a flag for what are in fact a wide variety of mnemonic products and practices. Okay? These different mnemonic products and practices require different forms of analysis. That's not to say they're not related to each other in some particular way. That is, the reminiscence you engage in at night or the humming of the tune as you leave the concert hall is not in some way shaped by the different kind of memory of the experience in the concert hall, that the individual and the collective are not related, that the reminiscence and the recall are not related in some ways, but these are the objects of analysis, not the presumptions of them. So my claim again was that the diversity, the fact that there is no one such thing that we mean by memory, is actually the starting point for memory studies, not the argument against it. The task of memory studies, insofar as there is one, is to articulate the differences among the different kinds of mnemonic products and practices, and then to inquire about the ways in which they may or may not relate to each other. This requires different disciplines. So I should make clear that when we talk about memory studies, we're not talking about a new discipline or a transdiscipline, but what we really literally mean by the term interdisciplinary. That is, we need the tools and knowledge of each of the distinct disciplines in such a way not that it effaces their differences, but reinforces them while beginning a conversation between them. A conversation between them is not aimed at eliminating the differences. It's not meant at effacing the boundaries. It's meant as building the bridges and building connections between them. So if there is to be a memory studies, it must be an interdisciplinary field rather than the elimination of disciplinary differences. But that requires some special kind of work. The kind of work I think that, and maybe I'm presenting this as a call to the people in this room and elsewhere, is for a little bit more outward-looking pedagogy. And what I mean by that is that I spend a lot of time at conferences getting annoyed that people don't know things that I consider basic and have to, well, you're not a sociologist, so you don't know who Halbwachs was, and do I have to explain again what collective memory means? How dull. I imagine that other people in the room listening to me talk about Richard Zeeman and Ingram's and episodic memory and semantic memory are, doing one of these. Oh my God, this guy doesn't do anything. If I can only get him in my introductory seminar, we'd set him straight. One of the problems is that so much of our writing and so much of our speaking is aimed at defending territory. We're saying what really has to happen is you have to come over to my building and I'll school you for 2 or 3 years and then you can start talking because you'll be one of us. We have to find a way of communicating what we think are the contributions of our side, our discipline. That is, for me, what I think that psychologists and literary critics and anthropologists should know about what it is that sociologists do. And I would hope that reciprocally, the members of those other disciplines would engage in and write in such a way, here's the basic things that I would want every sociologist to stop making stupid statements about when they're talking in a room about memory. If these conditions can be met, I think the conversation will be more productive than it has been. What's most important, I think, however, is that we notice that the disciplines themselves are constituted not just by their different methods, but by their different objects and their different subjects. So we tend to think of the difference between literary criticism and sociology in terms of the methods. Literary critics interpret texts, whereas sociologists do surveys or, I don't really know what they do. I am one, but I've never quite figured it out, or haven't yet. We do interviews and we gather data, and if we call it data, it's much more important. And psychologists do experiments. We need to not forget that there's also a difference not just in method, but in subject and object. Let me start with the object. The object is derived from my assertion that there are many different mnemonic products and practices. We have to recognize that even though we're all involved supposedly in memory studies, we really are talking about different objects. So the ability to recall a list of numbers under certain conditions, whether you're cold or hot or being yelled at or fed ice cream sundaes or whatever, is a different object of research than the cultural codes that are revealed in a film or that are manifest or articulated in a film or a literary text, which are different from the objects we're talking about when we're talking about what ordinary people know about history. The second, or the third, if we're talking about methods and objects, is finally subjects. The concerns of the disciplines and the attitudes towards our enterprise across the disciplines are, in fact, different. The point is not to deny those differences, but to learn to cross the 2 or probably by now 15 cultures that exist. There is a different purpose in doing research in what is known as the humanities than there is in the social sciences, than there is in the natural sciences. Not to say that there are not people who leave those differences behind or make contributions across those differences, but we need to remember, not in order to efface or to overcome, but to learn from those different purposes. I would say stereotypically, sociology as an enterprise is interested in testing hypotheses that can improve our social policy outcomes. I would say that the natural sciences are interested in to some extent or another, in manipulating nature or learning about how that might be possible or what are the limits. Humanities are engaged in a different enterprise, namely a participation in the culture that they're studying. I think all of these enterprises should be aware of and involved in the things that the others are doing, and I put myself very much on the humanist side of sociology, so I perhaps don't speak for the social sciences. The point then is there's no such thing, just to sum up, there's no such thing as memory because there are a wide variety of different things we mean by memory. And the ways in which we approach that is not to be accomplished by effacing those differences in method, object, and subject by creating some inter or trans discipline, but a field of discourse in which we can learn from each other rather than conquer or put out of business the people who come at things differently. And so far, if today is any evidence, there's lots of goodwill in that direction. Thanks.